And this works, yeah. Hi, my name's Jan Barsley. I was born in Los Angeles, and I owe my career to California public education. And I went to UC Davis and UCLA, so it's very fun to be back home. I was trained at UCLA in Japanese literature, and now I teach a class on geisha also, theater, Japanese women writers, and my own research is very much in Japanese women's studies. I've done a book called The Blue Stockings of Japan. It's about new women and early feminism in Japan. And now I'm doing the politics of beauty contests in Japan. So I'm in that Madame Butterfly fits in some interesting ways. I have 24 students this fall. We're doing all kinds of things with Butterfly. And I really wish they were here to see this wonderful day. Since my talk is all on images, I'm going to just take the lights down and we'll focus on that. And I'll just talk as we go. I wonder if, yeah, that looks good. Okay, and now we will just man the technology next. So today what I'm going to do, I guess I better hold it like this, or I'm not going to be able to see. I'm going to divide the material, there's so much material, I'm going to divide it into three main topics. One is building an audience for Madame Butterfly, why were people so interested in the opera and the play? And then what I'd like to spend the most time on is performing womanhood, and the American actresses and Japanese actresses who've been Butterfly and the race and gender politics that are connected with that. And then lastly, what I'd like to talk about is the post-war, and even a LA Greek theater performance of Madame Butterfly by a visiting Japanese troupe. So without further ado, we'll just go right into it. And which had been closed for so long to the West, is through Japanese villages and expos in the late 19th century. So here you have an image of London and a Japanese village that was built about the time of the Mikado that was wonderfully popular, and Londoners could come down and feel like they were walking through Japan. And Japan, as you see, is presented in a very romantic, pastoral kind of way. Next. Philadelphia had its own Japanese village in 1876, and here this is pictured. You see it gives an idea of a Japanese structure. So in a way, Americans get very interested in Japan through material culture and architecture. Next. This is a Japanese structure that was built in Chicago in 1893 for the big expo that they had there. Japan in the 1890s was very concerned about presenting itself to the world in positive ways, and also in ways that would be coded as Japanese. And so the government spent a lot of money putting this pavilion together. It was so exciting for people in Chicago that they used to crowd around the carpenters building it, and in Chicago they had to put rope to keep people away because they were so fascinated, just wanted to go up and touch it and talk with people. However, as you see, it looks very Japanese. So one of the things this pavilion signaled to people coming to Chicago was Japan is another place, Japan is exotic, Japan doesn't look like our own homes. And yet that difference about Japan was what built much of the interest. Next. At the time, the late 19th century, women's magazines are proliferating. And one of the things women's magazines are doing, like they do now, is promoting interior design. Among the plans that they were suggesting for interior design for an American home, one, it would show a woman is up on the trends, she knows about the popularity of Japanese things. It would also show that she's interested in a life beyond the U.S. that's not considered as commercial or industrialized, but that seems to be a Japan from the past, a simple culture where people are close to nature and Zen, and this would be represented in the things too. And the things also are very affordable, right? To buy a fan, to buy a Japanese parasol, it becomes something that the new middle class can afford. Next. However, it started with very wealthy people interested in Japanese interiors. The artist James Whistler put this peacock room together for a very wealthy man, and now you can see the entire room at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., but you see how elaborate it is, and what also would be read as very different and Asian in a different sense of art. Next. But other people could do this too. So here's a Texas home in the 1880s that's trying to give a kind of a Japanese ambiance. It's not trying to be Japan, but use some of these features, elements, that will give you a sense that this person is cosmopolitan. Interestingly, in Japan, in the 1880s and 90s, sort of elite Japanese, the new middle class of Japanese, were interested in doing the same thing. They wanted their interiors to reflect their consciousness of a modern life, a kind of cosmopolitan awareness of other countries. So what did they do? It wasn't incorporating Japanese elements. It was incorporating a big dining room table as opposed to individual tables, to have something as exotic as a chair, and just to eat oatmeal. This was all considered the Japanese way of doing it. So it was going back and forth, but in different ways. Next. And there were wonderful stores that emerged in the United States. This is one, probably the most famous, in New York City, called Van Teen's in 1908. And you see it's just crammed with curios. All kinds of Japan, China, other parts of Asia, represented in things. So for the person that would go in here, which was often female consumers, imagine how Asia looks. Asia can be held in your hand. Asia can be taken home. Asia's pretty and cute and makes you feel like you're maybe an artistic consumer too. You can't afford a big peacock room, but you can buy a vase. Next. And so because of this popularity of Japanese things associated with high taste, products were sold featuring little Japanese girls. And this also reflected the popularity of the Mikado, the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta in the United States. Next. And here you have a woman imagining herself. This is a catalog, kind of an ad for Van Teen's. So it's usually a white, middle-class woman dressed in a kimono, writing, imagining that she's having some kind of cosmopolitan, you know, a lady of the world. The kimono at this time is considered, in the United States, the mark of a woman that's kind of new and modern. Alice Roosevelt used to wear a kimono for private dinners in the White House. Then, of course, as you know, the big field of Impressionist interest in Japanese art. When Monet and Van Gogh and other artists see examples of Japanese art, they're overwhelmed by the use of color. They're particularly interested in what seems to be the lack of barriers between the artist and the artisan. And they're also interested in the everyday quality of the topics that Impressionists are using, that you could just take something from the everyday. So Monet paints this famous painting in the 1870s. He dresses his wife up in a kimono and puts a blonde wig on her. There's a kind of exuberance in this early craze for Japanese things. Not just one fan, but lots of fans. A big, kind of kabuki-like robe. But actually, one of the controversial things about this painting was you show a middle-class woman dressed as a prostitute. Or at least that was the code. What was this pushing another kind of boundary? And as we see, what kinds of meanings are created when we have people of one culture or race dressing like another? Next. And here you have Van Gogh again, just fascinated with the Japanese would have been a prostitute with long hair, lots of combs, this fabulous kimono, and here he is trying to copy it. So again, a sense of a very exotic Asia that's coming in through material culture. Images, things you can hold, things you can wear, often associated with women. Next. And then in the States, the Mikado is so popular that even without getting proper copyright, lots of American local troupes emerge, public, community kinds of theater, and they produce their own Mikado. And people love to dress up as Japanese. Next. Here you have Hispanic women in Texas dressed in kimono. There were all kinds of kimono clubs and Mikado clubs that arose. I don't know their whole story, but you get the sense that these women are getting together. What is going through their head as they dress like another person? What do they assume that Japanese woman to be? And all their information is from books like Madame Butterfly, the Mikado, and all the things that they're getting. So it's a very partial kind of knowledge of Japan. Next. In 2007, John Galliano, the designer at the time for Dior, decided that he would do his own ode to Madame Butterfly. So his 2007 spring show is in honor of Madame Butterfly and the Mikado. It's a very Orientalist kind of fashion show where each dress is named, and you can see these online, I put it in the notes at the end. Each dress is called something like Chocho-san or Sakura-san. So he uses the san, he gives the name to the dress. He at the end comes out as Pinkerton. And what this, I mean, it kind of responds to the way that the trade for high fashion, or the flavor of high fashion is so entwined with the exotic, whether it's the exotic Russian, the exotic African, or some imaginary exotic, is very tied up with haute couture and with the opera. And there's even a scene in the 2007 collection where he starts dressing every woman in black, and this is to refer to the Madame Butterfly suicide scene. So there's still fashion links to all of this interest in Madame Butterfly. Next. Okay, and I thought I'd go real quickly through the precursors, the fictional precursors, although Paul Floyd did an excellent job of telling you about this, so I'll go quickly. The first one we have was Madame Chrysanthemum in 1887, which is a travelogue. It's available online. Next. It takes you into Nagasaki, Japan. Here it is. Contemporary, of course. Nagasaki is a beautiful bay. You can go up on the hills and see where the foreigners used to live, for example, and many layers of history. We should not forget that Nagasaki was the second city that experienced the atomic bomb in 1945. That Nagasaki has also been the site of Christianity in Japan, and that many people in Nagasaki, because it's so far from Tokyo and Osaka, the major urban capitals, often feel somewhat distant from their own country, as if they're the other in Japan. In Nagasaki, at the time that Pierre Loti comes, in the late 1800s, there is a system of temporary wives, where young women are sold and homes are rented to visiting diplomats, sailors, a range of men. And so there is a definite foot in reality in Madame Butterfly. It might be interesting to know that Japan, in Nagasaki, enhances some of these sites as sites of tourism and encourages people to come to Nagasaki for many reasons, but one, to see the site of Madame Butterfly. So you can go to houses like this where, oops, is that still working? I think you turned it off. They are very romantic about it. See where Madame Butterfly, where the story started. At one place you hear the aria, One Fine Day, coming, and lots of Japanese are getting dressed up in 19th century costume. And Japan's a place where they also, many love dress up and having fun with this kind of history. Next. Okay, and here we have Pierre Loti. He had written many accounts, not only of Japan, but of North Africa, other parts of Asia, and he tends to be the kind of the man who travels to find exotic places, but also to have love affairs with exotic women. One of the important things about Madame Chrysanthemum to keep in mind is this book establishes the characters of the opera Madame Butterfly. So the Pinkerton character, certainly Madame Butterfly, is the wife prostitute. Sharpless might be his friend, Suzuki, and Goro, the marriage broker, is in this work called Kangaroo, or Kangoro, and kangaroo in French meant pimp. Right? So, and this is a book that describes Japan in very lush terms. It's a beautiful travelogue in some ways. You could feel like you're in a Shangri-La. But it's also a travelogue that's very definitely derogatory, that belittles Japanese, that describes Japanese as animals. So it's also within the kind of race politics operating in the West in the late 19th century. But there's an interesting part to Madame Chrysanthemum, pointed out by a Japanese critic, that Loti might be laughing at himself. That here's this craze for Japanese things in the West. He knows what that craze is. He wants to sell a book. What do people want to read? They want to read about exotic love affairs in exotic places, and he's giving it to them. So in some ways, this book could be filled with self-mockery. But this Madame Chrysanthemum seems to be a rather cold character, or calculating, or very aware that this is a job. She does not commit suicide. You can't imagine her even expressing any affection for the Pinkerton character, Lottie, which frustrates him. In the end, as he comes into her room just before he's about to leave, he notices that all she's doing is testing the silver coins that he's given her in payment. She knows it's a job, but for him, he feels like this absolves him of all responsibility. Clearly, it was a contract. She's materialistic, and he goes. Next. This brings up, at some point in every Madame Butterfly discussion, we have to talk about Orientalism. And one of the simple ways we could put it is its Western representations of Asia as the Orient, as feminine, as a place without a history. It doesn't change, it's just a culture that is very pastoral, old-fashioned, a place of doll-like people, pretty, and also one that you could feel is kind of the butterfly. The one that the Westerner could feel in contrast, makes the Westerner feel, I should say, rational, modern, masculine, powerful, scientific, able to conquer the world. And in that way, Madame Butterfly is a very Orientalist drama. East is East, West is West. Men are men, women are women in Madame Butterfly. And the play is actually placed on a geography of power relations at this time. The U.S. is expanding its power in the Pacific, conquered the Philippines, is definitely powerful there. And Japan, in contrast to Western audiences, can seem like the rescue from our own fears of the industrial and the commercial. And yet, what this view misses is that Japan itself was becoming an imperial power. That from 1869, Japan begins its own colonial project. It brutally takes over the northern island of Hokkaido, which is now just naturally considered like Japan. It begins to colonize Taiwan, Korea, and through the war, other parts of Asia in very aggressive ways. While we talk about the Orientalist aspects of Madame Butterfly, the West making Japan the feminized other that needs rescue, Japan is doing the same thing to Korea, to Taiwan, to Hokkaido. So Orientalism is a dynamic that can move around. At the same time, Japanese can also be self-orientalizing in a way to promote Japan as a mystical place that seems different from the West. That's a long topic. Next. And here's how Madame Chrysanthemum looked. It was a bestseller, reprinted 25 times in 5 years. Really shapes people's ideas of Asia. Next. But it wasn't the only book on Japan. Around 1900, there were so many books on Japan. The saying in America was, if you're a writer, you should have written about Japan. And you notice how beautiful the books are. There was a lot of interest in Japanese homes, in Japanese kimono, in the Japanese bride, and everything that made Japan different. But often these accounts missed the way Japan was modern, the way it was building a military, industrializing, and changing very much. Next. And originally then John Luther Long's story is, he never went to Japan, but he takes a lot of Madame Chrysanthemum's story as his inspiration. His sister was a missionary in Nagasaki and told him a lot about the temporary marriages and so forth. So he creates Madame Butterfly, and this is sold in magazine form and then as a book. But what's critical, I think, about the John Luther Long story is he introduces Kate. This is when Mrs. Pinkerton, the white Mrs. Pinkerton, comes into the story. When she sees Butterfly, her reaction is immediate. Oh, you pretty plaything, will you give me a kiss? And Butterfly retracts and says no. Later, Japanese make a lot of the scene in their own productions of Madame Butterfly before the war, making Kate seem even more crass and willing to buy the baby, whereas Madame Butterfly is the noble one who refuses the money but will give up her child. However, for American audiences, the Kate figure at this time was considered virtuous. She's willing to accept the interracial child of her husband's illicit affair. But for feminists in Japan, sometimes have used Kate as the image for talking about white and Japan relations, especially among white feminists and Japanese feminists. feeling sometime that white feminists were too out to, again, rescue things like tape. So the way these archetypal figures have a life beyond Madame Butterfly, I think is interesting too. Next. And here's the book. Next. David Belasco, as Paul Floyd said, was the great magician of the stage. He was the one that added the suicide scene. He was also the one that makes this a lot out of butterfly waiting, 14 minutes. And what we have to think of is that how Americans saw Butterfly was really shaped much more by stage productions, the opera, and the film than the early fiction. Next. Okay, but what I'd like to go into now is the women who played Cho-Cho-san, both in Japan and the US. So we'll start with the US first. Next. Okay, they were new women. So they're playing this doll-like woman who's considered the noble, naive young girl. But these women were considered quite larger than life in American society in the early 20th century. They challenged Victorian norms and notions of separate spheres. They were women out in public. They were women that demanded birth control, suffrage. They were interested in socialism and free love. They expressed themselves in arts, and they were writers, they were actresses, they were dancers. And you could tell who they were in part because of their new fashion. Short hair, more comfortable clothing, smoking cigarettes. So these were the women that shaped Butterfly, but they were nothing like Butterfly. And what that sets up is kind of a race grammar of the early 20th century where white American new women are seen as bigger than life and brainy and strong, and at the very opposite end are seen Japanese women who are small and naive and not able to express themselves. The doll-like Butterfly. Next. Here's Blanche Bates, who made Belasco's play, became very famous for her Madame Butterfly role, and was very much a new woman. But having these new women on stage meant that young girls came to the theater and were thrilled to see a woman on stage acting. But how does this big new woman become the so-called little Japanese woman? Is she hires a maid to live within her house. And she follows the maid all day. And then gets an idea of how does my maid walk, talk, sleep, laugh? What are her facial expressions? How does she use her hands? Even when her maid has a very sad letter that says her brother has died in the Russo-Japanese War, then Blanche Bates learns how to cry like a Japanese woman. So there's a kind of calculated quality to this. How do you cross race? But also an artistry, perhaps. How do you do all the things that will make you appear Japanese? And yet, you don't have to appear Japanese to Japanese. You only have to, as I say in this movie, My Geisha, fool an American audience. Next. The first opera singer in the US to sing Madame Butterfly was Geraldine Farrar, who becomes the first American diva. She was trained in Germany, but really became the first woman to be highly paid at the Met, and she sang Madame Butterfly for 2 decades. Like Blanche Bates, she also sought training and a kind of a body culture of what it might mean to be Japanese. She hired a Japanese actress to come live with her and coach her on how to move, how to act, and also how to even make her English sound Japanese. But Geraldine Farrar was the glamour girl of her time. She was considered larger than life, too, a real new woman, and had lots of young girl fans that would come. And this really establishes the beginning of the diva in American culture. But in both the case of Blanche Bates and Geraldine Farrar, when critics are critical of them, it's because, why? It's because they're too big, too smart, too assertive to be this young little Japanese woman, and they need to repress themselves. But when they do that, then critics are very happy with their performance and say they're even more Japanese than a Japanese. They could fool a Japanese if they were in Japan. They look so Japanese. But what we consider is both these women are hiring Japanese to work with them. Those Japanese are not part of the credits here. And that as white women on the stage, they have much more power to represent Japan to an American audience. And also at the same time, though, they're in kind of a fight to cut space for, carve out space for American women in American society. So a lot is going on in these early performances. Next. And here we have her in the last, next. But what this ran, and somebody was mentioning My Geisha, 1962. This is a funny film you can get on Netflix very easily. But why I put this here is it also talks again, even though it's post-war, 50 years beyond Geraldine Farrar, we're still talking about race crossing. How do you pass as someone else? In the film, Shirley MacLaine is trying to deceive her husband, who's a French film director, has never made it as big as she is. She's the successful movie star. And he wants to go to Japan to find the real Madame Butterfly. But and you see him in the film, it's a comedy, and it sort of laughs at his pretensions to find the real Madame Butterfly in Japan. And so he auditions lots of really young Japanese girls, and all of them fail. They're just not Japanese enough. And that's what he says. So it's but the audience knows this. Then the one young woman that can come and convince him that, yes, he has found his Madame Butterfly, is his own wife. Because she knows his fantasies. But there, also, you see this, how she's made up to look Japanese. This was a break for the makeup artist Shu Uemura. Have you heard about him? Shu Uemura, I think he has a store in Century City. But this was a young Japanese makeup artist. He was just kind of an understudy on the movie, but the real Hollywood makeup artist was sick that day, so he had to make up Shirley MacLaine. Everyone said, wonderful job, and that launched his career. Next. There was also, we talked briefly about the film Memoirs of a Geisha in 2005. One of the controversies here was, again, race crossing or ethnicity crossing. So, one, we have white women playing Japanese, but in 2005, we have Chinese women playing Japanese. In Japan, they said, why didn't you get somebody Japanese? But I don't think it worried them as much as in China. In China, this was considered hugely controversial. The film was banned in China initially, and the reason was having Chinese women play Japanese prostitutes, they said, in a film set in the same period that Japan was brutally colonizing China. So this really rubbed salt in the wounds in China. However, it raised a controversy on the internet. What does it matter if it's all fiction? Who cares who plays it? And, for example, Sandra Oh, the Korean-Canadian actress, said, so you mean I couldn't ever play Madame Butterfly or a character like this because I'm not Japanese-American? How many roles do you think I have as an Asian-American or Asian-Canadian? So if we start to cut it ever thinner, I'm never going to get a part. But it raised lots of controversy, too, over whether Hollywood knew the difference between one Asian or another. Anyway, interesting. Next. There have been other Madame Butterflies. 1915, Mary Pickford, another new woman, did a silent film, very sympathetic to Madame Butterfly. But here, too, we can think of the racial politics of the early 20th century in the U.S., that the lead characters, Madame Butterfly, Suzuki, are white, and all the other characters are Japanese. And maybe her parents are also white. So at that point, only for roles for Asians have to be the background. Next. But there's another interesting story here. In Japan in the 1980s, hip-hop became very popular. There's lots of hip-hop artists in Japan. What does that mean? Can a Japanese imitate an African-American art? Can they make it their own? Is that crossing popular? There's an artist, Iona Roselle Brown, who did this one on the left. And when I talked with her, I said, oh, that's such an interesting picture. I see so many pictures of white women looking Japanese and all these Madame Butterfly things, but I've never seen a black woman looking Japanese. And you know what she said? She said, oh, that's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, I guess you could look at it like that, but actually what I meant, it's a Japanese woman trying to look black. And she has lots of wonderful pictures around this idea. Next. And we can just skip that. Next. Okay, next. I'll talk real briefly. There was this diva that was mentioned, Miura Tamaki, who also played, she was the first Japanese woman to become famous in Madame Butterfly roles. And yet, even though she was known as the perfect butterfly abroad, she was considered a radical new woman in Japan. Next. Just to give you an idea, she was married and then she was divorced, which caused a scandal. She was able to debut as Cho-Cho-san in London, and this launches her career. She goes around the world playing Cho-Cho-san and other Orientalist heroines. And when her husband dies in 1929, she's in Hawaii, she doesn't come home. This is considered another scandal. Next. So here you have her and I think a white woman as Madame Butterfly. So what the critics said was that when Miura Tamaki played Cho-Cho-san, she always wore a kimono, she was very careful to give the idea of I am a Japanese woman. She would mix her more casual performances with Japanese folk songs and so forth. And so people thought, well, this is the real thing. That's what the comments said. This is the real thing. This dainty little doll-like woman is the real Madame Butterfly. So where they gave credit to Geraldine Farrar and Blanche Bates for being wonderful actresses, they only saw Miura as being Butterfly. Thus, all the ideas about who Butterfly is were projected onto Miura. However, a very clever marketing star, I guess in a way, she knew that this is what audiences wanted to see, and she worked at making herself Japanese. I mean, she was, of course, Japanese, but how do you portray yourself as Japanese to a Western audience? So she took lessons from a Japanese choreographer, just like Blanche Bates and Geraldine Farrar. You know, she tried to study what's going to be coded Japanese. How do I become Japanese? And yet, when audiences saw her, they said, "Oh, the perfect Japanese. She's not even acting. We're happy to be in her presence." However, in, for example, Hawaii, where there was lots of Japanese Americans working in the sugar trade and a very low status there as immigrants, they were so thrilled when Miura Tamaki came to Honolulu because she represented acceptance in the United States. She represented someone being on the stage who was Asian and having all these people around the world pay attention to her. Next. And here's just a few things. But in high school, what made her different was she went to school. And she was known for riding a bicycle around Tokyo, which was an emblem of girls' freedom. You didn't have a chaperone, you didn't have your parents around, you were just free on your bicycle. Next. But what this magazine is one I've written about in the Blue Stockings of Japan. And you notice that the images are of classical Greece or Rome. We see a warrior. While American audiences were interested in Madame Butterfly, what was the big news in Tokyo around 1912, 1913 was the new woman of Japan. And there was women that got together that made their own magazine that said, we are modern women, we are proud to be new women, and we too believe in birth control, free expression for women, free love, choosing our own husbands. The right to vote was something a lot of men still didn't have, so that wasn't part of their agenda, but they were the ones creating all the news in Japan. Next. And here they are at a public speech. Next. And what was the play they were most interested in at the time was A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen, where Nora famously walks out the door. So while Blanche Bates and Geraldine Farrar were interested in how do you look Japanese were thinking, how do you look Norwegian, I guess it is, you know? How do you do that? And you translate it in Japanese, and you wear Western clothing, you have Western sets, and this was considered a very radical play in Japan. Lots of intellectuals came. Plays like this were published in Japanese and became major topics of controversy and discussion. But the women that played Nora were considered, just like Geraldine Farrar, as the new women of Japan. The women that other women wanted to see on stage making a difference. Next. But what about geisha? Now, let me say a little word about that, a few words about that, because geisha come up so much in Madame Butterfly. Geisha around this time, 1915, if you were an elite geisha in Tokyo, then you could have quite an interesting life, talking with There were parties every night, lots of performances. You dealt with a cream of male intellectual and government society, but you were still considered something that Japan was often embarrassed about. Especially women did not, middle-class women did not like the geisha institution. You couldn't blame them. Their husbands would often spend a lot of money in geisha houses. There were a lot of affairs outside of marriage, and women were vulnerable to VD. So some of the opposition to geisha really came from women's reform societies. Unfortunately, it was visited, that kind of anger, upon the geisha rather than upon the men that were making the system. But just to give you an interesting idea of how the politics played out, in 1915 there was the enthronement of the new emperor, Emperor Taisho. And the geisha too said, we want to be part of this. Geisha were very patriotic, and they wanted to be in the official parade. But the Reform Society said, no, this shows that Japan is nothing more than a prostitute. So they were removed from the program. However, being rebellious and assertive, they decided they would do it anyway. And all over Tokyo on the day of the enthronement, geisha performed in the street, spontaneous performances that drew lots of attention away from the official one, and of course delighted people for that kind of what would you say, against the state kind of excitement where women are going out of bounds. This is a cartoon that actually looks funny, but it captures a controversy. What happens when the new woman of Japan meets the old-fashioned woman, or the geisha? And in fact, some new women, those writers of that magazine, decided, hey, let's go to the geisha quarters. It can't be all for men. And so they actually went to the geisha quarters of Tokyo one night, and this created quite a controversy. You see how in typical cartoons of new women, either in the West or Japan, the new women are made to seem masculine, to have beards, to be leering at these, and the geisha looks like she's so afraid of them. But this kind of thing, the idea that new women and geisha would talk, that they would somehow bridge this border dividing them, was the source of incredible controversy. It in the end, caused the government to want to ban their magazine. Passers-by threw stones for 3 days at one of the new women's house. So we can think of these borders between new women and geisha and so forth are actually very tense in their own day. Next. Oh, yeah, we can skip that. Next. And then let's go to the post-war. During the war with the United States and Japan, Madame Butterfly was not performed. Miura Tamaki did not perform Madame Butterfly during that time. After the war, when Japan was occupied, mainly by American troops from 1945 to 1952, 7 years, there were a lot of different cultural exchanges, but there was also, again, another Madame Butterfly situation. Japan had been 60% destroyed. Its empire, I'm not trying to make this sound good, but its empire was over, but its empire had collapsed. Lots of Japanese returned to their home country. There was no food, no infrastructure, so lots of women were forced into prostitution, literally thousands of women. So there was a lot of liaisons between American GIs and Japanese women. Some of these were true love relationships, some of these were sex for sale. There were a lot of children born of these relationships that were neither accepted in Japan or the United States. So there's a real Madame Butterfly story that emerges again in great numbers in the post-war in Japan. And in this, there was a comedy. It's a comic that was part of the Pacific Stars and Stripes that makes a new character Baby-san as if there's something funny, as if she's part Madame Butterfly in that she seems doll-like, but she's seductive and she's manipulative of this very innocent American sailor. So it's almost as if Pinkerton is not a mean guy in this one. He's just a naive young boy from the States in Japan and doesn't know what to make of this very manipulative Japanese woman. And next. There was also a bunraku play, a puppet play of Madame Butterfly in the mid-50s. It became famous for having the puppets kiss, because the kiss is not something that you see on stage or films very often in Japan, but Americans thought that kissing was very democratic and that Japanese movies should include more kissing, so they had the puppets kiss. And the play was not terribly successful, but one thing that's interesting about it is the way that the language is used and the music is used. Because in a puppet play, you use the shamisen, so Puccini disappears. There's the story, but no opera. And yet, Japanese stories, Japanese puppet theaters have plenty of suicide, hopeless love stories, so it's enfolded in that. Madame Butterfly and all the other characters now speak Japanese, and most of their lines are narrated. Next. Oh, we get it. Yeah. In 1953, there was a much publicized performance of Madame Butterfly at the Greek Theater here in Los Angeles. The troupe Fujiwara came, and they were going to perform Madame Butterfly all in Japanese. The governor of California attended, and so did the mayor of Los Angeles. And all the profits were given to the Japanese American Community League as a way, it doesn't say that in the paper, but as a kind of atonement for the incarceration of Japanese Americans during the war. It was meant to be a goodwill project. And in early 1953, there were lots of goodwill projects. The U.S. was trying to build an alliance with Japan against communism in the Pacific. Japan was trying to strengthen commercial ties with the United States in order to recover from the war. So a lot of these projects took place. But Madame Butterfly then did diplomatic work too. Next. The movie Sayonara, the book came out in 1954, and the movie in 1957. In some ways, this book and movie is another Madame Butterfly story. There's a very tragic tale and a suicide that interestingly references Madame Butterfly, but also the puppet theater. So there's a kind of merging of American romance and Italian romance, I guess, and Japanese. But it's also a story of racial tolerance. This comes out in the mid-1950s during the Civil Rights Movement. Can there be interracial children? Can there be interracial marriage? At the time, there were plenty of states in the U.S. that still had laws against interracial marriage. But in this movie, in the book, it ends very sadly, very Madame Butterfly, with the couples have to part, the young woman and the man, the lead characters. But Marlon Brando felt that that was really a downer, and that it would be more positive for race relations if the two got married. So in the end, it ends with this kind of uplifting note. But it was based on a true story to some extent, that for a while American GIs could not take their brides back home to the U.S., and then the law was changed. Next. But we also have to remember, thinking of race during the Civil Rights Movement, of Leontine Price, who gave one of these first televised performances, Puccini's Tosca. But this was a day when this was considered radical, and a lot of local affiliates refused to carry this performance, even though it had great critical acclaim. Next. Now back to My Geisha. In a different way. 1962, this film was made. The part you see that there's in these ads, the mirror, that Shirley MacLaine keeps looking in her mirror, and when she sees herself here, it's a geisha, and this happens in the film too. But what this is really referring to is the post-war gender politics of the U.S. in the 1950s, and the idea, which also comes up in Sayonara, that white American women had become too masculine, overbearing, and that American men, especially white American men, were being manipulated by these women. At this time, there's even discussion of this in the LA Times, with a photograph of a woman being a huge marionette of a little white man. And so the idea is, if the American woman has become masculinized, what is the answer? To become more Japanese. So again, you have the same grammar we saw with Blanche Bates and Geraldine Ferrar, where the white woman is the too brainy, too aggressive woman, and the Japanese woman is seen as the ultra-feminine. But here in My Geisha, it actually becomes a lesson that Shirley MacLaine has to learn, that she has to learn to suppress her own ambitions as the wife, as the movie star wife, and let her husband succeed. But in this way, then, there's also an argument made that how does Japan become our ally after this long and harsh war? And in part, it's through the celebration of Japanese women and children as innocent, and also through culture. So films like Sayonara and My Geisha take you through kabuki and gardens and No Place and things like that. And this really does work in making Americans more protective again of Japan, such that by 1960, if you've been to Europe, for people who've been to Europe, their second destination was Japan. And inspires a huge amount of tourism to Japan. Next. And we're almost at the end. There's a very funny one where I Love Lucy plays in Asia, which is, again, how could a big white woman be a young Japanese woman? But it's actually very funny. Next. This, I mentioned I was studying beauty queens. This is the first Japanese Miss Universe. Miss Universe used to be a big deal here in the Southland. And in 1959, the first Asian woman became Miss Universe. As you know, Long Beach was a Navy town, and so Navy men acted as escorts for all the beauties from around the world. At the time, when Miss Japan won, she's 5'7", and everybody was laughing, oh, we're going to have to find a really tall American, because the sexual norm or gender norm was to have the man taller. But look how the man looks. This is the coronation ball. When I show this, when I'm talking about beauty queens, people usually go, he's Pinkerton. But what a difference in their relationship. They're both equals, they're both, and yet one could ask, is there any space for a Japanese man in this? Next. Okay, and then what I wanted to end with, if we still have, a little time, is that Japan, you can see Madame Butterfly in Japan, and there's tourist sites in Nagasaki about Madame Butterfly, and I wanted to show you this clip of the finale of the opening ceremonies of the 1998 Nagano Winter Olympics. This is actually packed with controversial politics. To give you briefly what they are, should a democracy like Japan have an emperor still? That's controversial. What is Japan's responsibility for its war activities in Asia? Has it ever really atoned for that? That's part of this. What about Japanese women? How is their status? Do you support Japanese athletes? And in this, they're saying, yes, we do. The final scene is of Midori Ito, the most decorated Olympian ever in Japan. She's dressed as the sun goddess. Wait till you hear the music. Okay.
会場での最終ランナーはクリス・ブーンさんです。1995年 NGO スタッフとしてアフリカで地雷の
Chris Moon, who will enter the stadium with the torch. In England, he lost the lower part of his right leg and arm when a mine exploded in March 1995 while he was working to remove landmines in Mozambique. Overcame his handicap and completed the London Marathon using an artificial leg in 1996. The last year, he was presented with a bravery award by Diana, Princess of Wales. He has the honor now of bringing the Olympic torch into the ceremony stadium. Chris Moon, surrounded on his passage by the 150 Yukinkos, the snow children. Show producer Kaito Asari chose Moon to lead the torch into the stadium to symbolize Japan's process of atoning for its sins. He raises the torch to the emperor. Said Asari, the producer, Japan is responsible for the curse of wars in the first half of the century. Chris Moon represents the sadness of the past century. The children represent the hope for the next century. Now Masaka Chiba will make the lap.
Chiba was a bronze medalist in the women's 10,000 meter race at the 1997 World Track and Field Championships in Athens.
the handoff to Takanori Kono and his two fellow members of the Nordic combined team that has won gold in the Olympics. Gold in Albertville, silver in Lillehammer. Snow children take their place up the stairs.
These Nordic combined athletes are really heroes here in '92 and '94. The most watched Winter Olympic sport in Japan, not figure skating, Nordic combined.
Almost surrounded by Ikada and Abe, and the fourth member of their gold medal team will say the athletes' oath, Kenji Fujiwara. Hiromi Suzuki, winner of the women's marathon at the 1997 World Track and Field Championships in Athens. She will now scale 148 steps to Puccini's Madame Butterfly. One great day, we will see. Steps, and one last torchbearer remains.
Keep your eye on the fans at the top of the steps.
It's Midori Ito, the most decorated figure skater in Japan history. Silver medalist in Albertville, world champion of '89. She will light the cauldron. She was the first to carry the flame in Japan. When the torch arrived at Narita Airport in late December, she received the handoff at Narita. The first and last